Welcome to the online lecture related to Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's an interesting text. Sorry, I was a little tardy in getting it to you, but hopefully the PDF file you'll have had a chance to read through. It's not a very, very lengthy read, especially the version that I showed you is a nice abridged version. It's got an awful lot more detail in it than the text that we looked at, but it is an important text, and if you want to go back and read the rest, you certainly can. A few controversial things about the text. It was published, of course, in 1861, and that would have made her in her 30s, basically. It was edited. You'll notice I've got a copy of the title page of the first edition there. It was edited by Lydia Maria Child. Now, of course, Harriet Jacobs, being of African-American but also of Caucasian European descent, and a woman who was enslaved through her childhood and young adulthood, a lot of controversy about whether or not someone of that background could have written something like this without an awful lot of help. The answer to that is kind of an open question. I will say that she went around and lectured quite a bit, and in her lectures she was quite well-spoken. I don't think that she was the kind of person who was had a high degree of formal education because it wasn't afforded to her. But Lydia Maria Child, being a staunch abolitionist and part of that circle of writers up in the Boston area, was one who helped her a lot with the editing of it. Now, I don't think that she fabricated it. I think that the writing style is something that probably she needed the most help with on that. And she may very well have helped her, or others may have helped her in formulating her speeches. There's nothing to indicate that Child did anything more than take the authentic details of her life and frame it in a manner that would have been considered readable for the time. To us, it seems like a highly formalized and kind of stilted style, but to the time that was what it was. That was what was considered to be an appropriate style for something like this. It follows in the footsteps of a number of different sorts of slave narratives, going back to things like Olaudah Equiano's narrative, and of course, Frederick Douglass's narrative as well. So there were a number of these and they sold quite a bit up north. They were used to sort of support the anti-slavery movement in the North. There wasn't much of an anti-slavery movement in the South, but it also sold quite a bit overseas. There were a number of people in Europe who wanted to read more and more about what the lives of these individuals was like. Some of them took a political interest in it. Some of them were very hands-off. A lot of myths and misconceptions about the American Civil War, and this is, of course, written right on the eve of it. And so no question about it, it was published in part to influence public opinion. Okay, let's just be frank about that. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Lots of literature is written to influence public opinion. The Grapes of Wrath was written to influence public opinion about the plight of the poor in the Great Depression. So, there's a long history of literature providing social commentary. And in this case, the literary genre, of course, is autobiography, but more specifically slave narratives. And I want to invite you to think about this, that those earlier captivity narratives, and we read Rowlandson's, the slave narratives are kind of operating out of that. So we get, in the 18th century, you get a lot of these captivity narratives. What was it like for someone to be kidnapped and brought into captivity among the Native Americans, and how different they are and how strange their ways are from that of Europeans, and so on and so forth. This is a little bit along those lines, because people were interested in captivity narratives, like what is life like in a different set of circumstances, kind of thing, right? Something that you and I would never live, but someone else is living it now, and what that would be like. But I want you to also think in these terms, that the roles are reversed with the slave narrative, because with the captivity narratives like Rowlandson, they're almost calculated to get people to say, oh my goodness, how savage, how barbaric is this other ethnic group. But the ironic thing, and by design, that slave narratives were designed to do is to say, white European Western civilization likes to think of itself as being morally and technologically and intellectually superior to others, and yet it's they, or that system, that is perpetuating this victim situation among innocent people. In other words, who's the actual barbarian? Who's the actual savage? Who's the one that's morally superior or inferior? Now, of course, there were a lot of people on both sides of this, and both sides of the Atlantic even, who kept up with the issue of slavery, and some had very strong feelings. Don't overestimate the idea that up north there were everyone up north was an abolitionist, everyone down south was in favor of slavery. The problem with the people down south who weren't in favor of slavery is they frequently got their throats cut, and their homes burned down. And if you manumitted slaves in some states, it was illegal to free your slaves in some states, not without going through an awful lot of rigmarole. And people who advocated abolition down south, you might think, well, we have a First Amendment in this country. Well, until somebody knocks you over the head, burns your house down. Up north, there was a strong sense of abolition among many Northerners, but not all. Many new immigrants to the country thought, this is not our fight. This is nothing new to us. We don't have anything to do with that. That's those people down there. I don't even go down south. It's none of my business what they do down there, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of that. And there were even people as bright as Nathaniel Hawthorne who felt that slavery was terrible, but that it wasn't worth fighting a war over. I don't know. I think history hasn't been very kind to that kind of point of view. But, he looked at the carnage of the Civil War and said, let them go to hell down there. Let the South, they want to break away, give it to them. This is not worth going and fighting and dying with these crazy people for. So there were a lot. What I'm trying to get at is this, is that we like to think of the Civil War and the lead up to it and the issue of slavery as being very cut and dried and either or. And there were a lot of different kind of nuanced positions on it. I don't say nuanced in the sense of sophisticated. I mean, nuanced as in it was a multifaceted thing. It was a complicated issue. And this was a piece that was designed to try to bring some clarity to it. This piece and Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in the 1850s, really moved a lot of the people up north to say, we've got to stop this somehow. We won't go into all of the history of that led up to the Civil War, but I will note this, that essentially the problem was one of an inability to project the future of the country in a balanced political setting. That wasn't very clear, wasn't it? The problem was that as the country was expanding into new states, every time you admit a state, it had the potential of upsetting the balance of power in the legislature and Congress. Because if you add more anti-slavery states, eventually they're going to outvote the slavery states, and they're going to try to outlaw slavery. If you add too many pro-slavery states, then it perpetuates it. But it does seem that geography played a part in it, to be honest with you. Slavery was at its heart an agricultural sort of system, and the future of the West was simply not geographically set up to support a thing like that. The Great Plains simply didn't require large amounts of human labor to farm, because they weren't farming labor-intensive crops that required a lot of things by hand. They were farming things like wheat, which can be done with combines and horses and things of that nature. They don't have to have field harvesting people. They don't have to separate anything like they do with cotton and things of that nature. And in West Texas, although there was cotton, there really isn't. That's not really. Go travel out there. There's some up in the Panhandle, but to be honest with you, the Rocky Mountains, the Western, in other words, slavery sort of ran out of geographical territory to expand into in some respects. So in a way, slavery was, that pro-slavery caucus in Congress was doomed once the expansion finished its way out across the continent anyway. But that's for another day. Essentially, the legislature couldn't come to a decent compromise. They tried the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Everything legislative failed. So people eventually said, let's take this to the Supreme Court, the judiciary. The judicial branch, we have three branches, of course, the legislative, the judicial. When the Dred Scott decision came down and Chief Justice Taney wrote these infamous words that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. I mean, Taney goes down as, of course, one of the worst worst jurists in the history of the country, but he was a Supreme Court Chief Justice, handed down probably what is considered one of the worst cases ever decided by the Supreme Court, and that's the Dred Scott decision, because it closed the door on the idea that the judicial branch will step in and solve this problem for us. So if the legislative branch can't do it, and the judicial branch can't do it, then the election is held in 1860, and Lincoln is elected, and Lincoln runs on a platform that not that he would abolish slavery, but that he would stop its expansion, which is effectively, as I just said, politically the same thing as abolishing slavery. I mean, if we end up with 50 states and only 15 of them have slavery, guess what? The other 35 are going to vote it out. And the 15 states down in the Confederacy knew this. So as soon as Lincoln's elected, promising to stop the spread of slavery while not outlawing it in the slave states, they knew what was coming. And so they decided, we're going to jump ship before this goes on. So in a way, slavery resulted in a threefold failure of all three branches of the government being unable to do anything about it. But up to this point, the fascination with the lives of people who were enslaved, especially in the North, especially overseas, was very, very strong. Now let's talk a little bit about the story itself. This is really a story. I would say it's a sad story because it's about a sad part of her life. Not all of her life was sad, though, which is good. I mean, after you read this, you think this is terrible. After you reflect on the rest of her life, you think, well, what an overcomer she was. And she ended up having quite a successful life later on and enjoying a lot of happiness, which is great. So just trying to not get you too depressed. But her discovery in her childhood, you remember the passage where she says, I kind of grew up when I was really little, not knowing there was anything different about me. I mean, she understood that everybody had a different kind of skin color and everything. And this was not terribly uncommon in the South. The childhood that she had was not terribly uncommon, because when children, black or white, in slave-owning families and slave-holding families raised their small children, there was a great deal of interaction between the children of the enslaved people and the slave holders. If you were a little bitty kid out in the nursery or out in the yard, you would play with your friends. But up to a certain age, you didn't really know. And what she says is, up to a certain age, I didn't know what my legal condition was. And it came as quite a shock at that one juncture where she learns, oh my gosh, wow, you mean I'm somebody's property? Quite an interesting situation. Second to that is a sense of alienation because of her lack of legal status. Most people don't know this, but the laws concerning enslavement in many southern states today you would look at them and you would just say, what in the world? But at the time, it was very much accepted that they had basically no legal rights whatsoever. I mean, for example, Frederick Douglass gives an account of a slaveholding man who murdered a guy just because he talked back to him, murdered him, shot him in a river. And never faced any legal consequence for it at all. And in Frederick Douglass's book, he says, you can look this man up today. He still lives in this county in Maryland and down this road, on this street, whatever. You can go find him, and he is a free man today. And, dozens of people saw him shoot this man in cold blood. And so slaves had no rights whatsoever. In fact, you didn't even have, and this is very important, you didn't even have sort of an ability to establish a permanent romantic family marriage bond. Even the marriage vows of slaves read, until death or distance do we part. Think about that. Until death or distance do we. Today we say until death do we part, and we hope people don't get divorced, but some people do. But the goal here is the rest of our lives. Slaves weren't even entitled to that. Until death or one of us gets sold, basically, is what it's saying. The idea that you could sell someone's children from them. Someone has 3 or 4 children and you just decide you're going to sell them and then they may never see them again. The very idea of that is just so alien to us today, that you're not able to establish, in many cases, a permanent romantic bond with a partner to have children. And you see this in the story. By the way, she takes the pseudonym Linda, as you know. You see this in the story where her mother had to sneak back and see her at night secretly because she couldn't be with her. And it's just heartbreaking to think that you would do that to a mother or to a child, to separate them like that just for the sake of money or what have you. That inability to establish familial or romantic or mother-child bonds is just incredibly disruptive. Now, she did have that. She did have a bond. She did have that with her grandmother. She grew up with her grandmother, and really her grandmother was more of a mother than her mother wasn't able to be, of course. And she lives with her grandmother, but the heartbreaking instance in which she has to tell her grandmother that she is pregnant out of wedlock, and her grandmother just utterly rejects her. I mean, you and I I don't know about you. Whenever I read the passage, I think, oh my gosh, this is the only person this girl's got, and loves her beyond all measure. And to have her grandmother reject her like that is just crushing. It just crushes your heart to see that. And then even after her emancipation, the ambiguity of her status, she's not fully settled until pretty much well after the war, to be honest with you, because they had this thing called the Fugitive Slave Act. And in the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, it said that if that is an act of Congress signed by the President of the United States, if a slave escapes from a slave state and goes up north, the slave owner is able to go up there and get the slave and drag the person back down there. And if you, as a free person in the North, aid or abet this enslaved person's escape, or you hide them, you can go to jail. Now, it's very rare that anybody did, okay? But that was one of the things that really pushed the country over into civil war, because previously a lot of people up north said, this is not our fight, this is not our system, we don't do slavery, whatever, blah, 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 that's none of my business. But now you just made every northerner, you just made it his business, because now you don't get to just ignore it. You have to be a willing participant in its repressive methods. You have to be a supporter of slavery. And if you don't turn the slave in, you're going to go to jail. Well, as I said, very few people did. But that's why you had the Underground Railroad. That's why people had to escape not just across the Mason-Dixon line. They had to go all the way to Canada to be completely free. So that ambiguity of her status after her emancipation, will I be dragged back down? And there were many cases where someone was dragged back down south, even though they were declared free up north. Many cases. Dred Scott was one of those cases. And so let's take a look again at what the purpose was behind the work. And I identify three things here. First of all, it was to arouse curiosity. And I mean, that's just the number one thing. You've got to have some publicity there, right? You got to create publicity and publicity, not just for herself. I don't think she made a lot of money off of this. What you would do is you would publish a book, and then you would go on a speakers or lecture circuit. And of course, people do that today. They sign books at Barnes and Noble or wherever, and so she would have a lecture circuit, and you'd get paid for the lectures, and you get paid for the books, etc. But she didn't make a lot of money, believe me. This was not a big money maker, although it sold quite widely and was quite a famous book. It was designed partly, let's arouse some curiosity. What would it have been like? I mean, look at the title itself: Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Oh, incidents. That's a very morally ambiguous term, isn't it? Incidents? What kind of incidents? What are we talking about here? Well, part of it, to be honest with you, is something everybody knew. And that is that the system of slavery was not just a system of forced labor and the commoditization of human beings. There was also a sexual abuse component to it. Okay? So when I say arouse curiosity, yeah, probably there were some people who were like, hey, I've heard that down south, especially girls, are highly sought after by some of these slave owners, especially if they're attractive. That was true. That was quite true, as a matter of fact. In fact, you can see from some of the so-called slave auctions that some of the highest prices were paid for attractive young girls. That's not because they could do lots of heavy labor and you'd make your money back on them, okay? If you know what I mean. Now, they paid a lot of money for healthy young men who could do a lot of heavy labor and whatnot. Or, and this is another big thing, Frederick Douglass was a very skilled shipbuilder. So many of these people who were enslaved had very, very valuable skills, and you could put them to work and you could make a lot of money off of their labor, their talent, their work. Yeah, nice system, right? But there's no reason that a 15-year-old really attractive young lady would go for the same amount as somebody who could read and write and do math and keep books and was an accountant, right? So we know something was up there. Another thing that's kind of important here. So there was a clear, unabashed opportunity here to spark curiosity, create a little publicity. Why? Partly to promote her career, sure. Right? She has to make a living. What are you going to do? She didn't have a way of making a living. She had to go do something. So she wrote, she gave lectures. She fought for the cause of abolition, sure, but she had to make a living. At least at first. She had children and that she had to take care of and all of those kinds of things. But the most important reason really was to change public opinion on the issue of slavery, obviously. Not on political grounds, but moral grounds. And here I want you to realize that this book and Uncle Tom's Cabin have a lot in common. It's a lot like Fuller's autobiography because it's about a very unusual experience, a very unusual life in many respects, and it's chronicling that. And of course, it arouses the curiosity of the reader to say, "What in the world? What must this have been like?" People like to read about other people who have different life experiences, but here, it's an argument against slavery, obviously. Her entire life is an argument against slavery. But the main argument is that it is a threat to the family. Okay? So Harriet Jacobs' childhood, again, not so atypical, right, for down there, but unusual for the reader. They would never have. And of course, she has to spend time hiding out. She's constantly running from this vile cretin, Dr. Flint, whose actual name was a Dr. Norcom, just a nasty little man, who is the villain of the story. And psychologically, there's something wrong with this guy. I mean, he's just like obsessed with her. He's a stalker. He builds this cabin to try to house her, to keep her away from him. Now, here's the other thing. And Jacobs points this out, that the law said that slave children follow the condition of the mother. In other words, when a slave woman has a child, the child is a slave, okay? No matter who the father is, right? That's an interesting sort of legal sleight of hand to say, well, she had a baby. Should the baby be free or should the baby be enslaved? Because this baby looks really white, okay? And you know what? It looks an awful lot like the owner of the household here. But the law conveniently says, oh no, slave children always follow the condition of the mother, not the father, the mother. Okay? Now, not that they could stay together all the time, because you could sell that baby, and they frequently did. Well, everybody knew why that law existed. It was in order to be able to get rid of the evidence that some slaveholding man had impregnated one of his female enslaved people on his property. And imagine a system where men sell their own biological children like property, like cattle, right? That's just shocking to the conscience. But it was convenient. And by the way, the women who were married to these men who got these enslaved women pregnant seemed to be pretty okay with the idea of getting rid of the evidence because of the humiliation that would have been on their heads in the eyes of the community. You know, if you're married to a man and he owns slaves and, 10 or 11 or 12 children of slaves at his plantation look an awful lot like him, people start talking. So if you're the wife, you're happy to get rid of the kids, right? So it was a horrifying situation. But two of the big themes in the text are, of course, romantic love and the inability of her to find satisfying romantic love because of the limitations on her. And then also the spiritual sanctity of the American family. And it has an awful lot to do with, in common with Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I know we're not reading here. It's a very, very lengthy book. But for decades in the United States, people made political arguments against slavery. It's a bad idea politically. It's bad public policy. It's bad for the economy. It's bad, And that only got so far. But it was really in the 1850s and early 1860s when people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Harriet Jacobs and others began writing about slavery's impact on the American family, that real changes in public opinion started to take place. There were political changes. People began to say, man, the Congress can't do anything. The White House won't do anything. The Supreme Court won't do anything. And yet this begins to be a word. But it really, the reason I think that the country went to war was not necessarily because we had a political dispute. Yes, we did. And war is a result of that. But the reason we really went to war over this is because people were at a moral impasse. Either you believe that these individuals are people, fully people, not 2/3 of a person, not half of a person, and whatever else, kind of magic tricks up your sleeve rhetorically you can come up with. But either you believe they're people or you don't. And if you believe they're people, then they're entitled to the same rights you are. It doesn't matter where their parents or grandparents or their ancestors came from. It doesn't matter what color they are. It doesn't matter what dialect they speak. It doesn't matter. They're either people or they're not. And if they're people, all of the rest of those Bill of Rights follows. And it was just a fundamental disagreement over what constitutes personhood. And secondly, it was the destruction of the American family that really resonated with, especially women up north. That this is an evil system because it is, when you give one human being the power of life and death over other human beings, not subject to the law, we are morally flawed creatures and we will abuse it. We will abuse it. If there is not law to keep individuals in check, then they will abuse that power. And they will do so for money, they will do so for power, but they will also do so in some cases for sexual gratification. And that shocked and appalled women, especially middle class and upper class women in the North, that was going on down there. And nobody wanted to talk about it because it was a dirty little secret, but everybody knew it was true. And so, and then, and it was also a period where, in the aftermath of the sentimental tradition in the Victorian era, people were beginning to believe that you didn't just marry for money or for status. You did marry for love. And you'll see that Linda, Harriet in here repeatedly says, I was denied my choice of a lover. Every woman reading this book would have said it's wrong not to allow a woman to choose her husband. This is just wrong. This is just a fundamental basic right. No, it's not in the Constitution. No, it's not written down somewhere in the clouds. But you just know deep in your heart that every woman has a right to choose who her husband should be. And no matter what her legal status is, it's just one of the most basic bedrock rights. I mean, this is the most intimate relationship you have with another human being. And to say that you have no authority over what happens to you, or how often someone trades you around like, a horse, this is just horrible. It's worse than prostitution because you don't even get the fruits of your labors. Think of that. This was appalling to women of sensibility and education up north, and it made a huge difference in public opinion here. The idea that slavery assaults the traditional family, and you see how many times there's a direct address to white female readers, and the need to build empathy. I mean, Flint is just this out-of-control megalomaniac, right? I mean, he's not in charge of a government, but he's in charge of his own little world. He can do whatever he wants to with people. No human being should have that kind of authority over another human being. It's just it's just wrong. And it invites abuse. But when her grandmother even rejects her, you get this very moving passage that's directly to the readers. Remember Charlotte Temple, right? The direct address to the reader. Here we have a similar sort of rhetorical technique, but for very different, well, not terribly different purposes. Think about this. She had to go and confess to her grandmother that she had gotten pregnant by a man that she was not married to. She says, look, I was being pursued by Flint, and I felt like I could find safety and protection in the arms of somebody that I really cared for. Did I do the right thing? Look at how much she apologizes for it, just over and I'm just such a horrible, wretched, sinful person. I kind of feel like she has to do that with the readers of the era because, again, a lot of these women would be reading this and saying, oh, she became a you-know-what, right? She did the dirty deed. And they would instantly lose sympathy. Call it judgmental if you want to. I certainly think it would be so. But the Victorian prudery at the time would have said any woman who compromises her virtue, there is no excuse for it. And what she's trying to say is, there's no excuse for having made a bad mistake, but understand that my circumstances contributed to it, right? I'm taking responsibility for my decisions and my choices, but at the same time, I don't have what you have. So before you judge me, and there's this famous passage where she says, pity me and pardon me, O virtuous reader. You never knew what it is to be a slave, to be entirely unprotected by law or custom. Think about that. Okay, listen, upper class, middle class white ladies up north. Glad you care about people like me, but just remember before you start wagging your finger and saying, oh, she slept with this man outside of it, you are protected. The law protects your virtue. Anybody tries to violate you, and you'll have him thrown in jail. You don't have a Dr. Flint running around after you and getting away with what he does. Now, it happens, but you have legal recourse against a jerk like that. I don't. To have the laws reduce you to the condition of chattel, which means property, entirely subject to the will of another. You have remedies. You can run down to the sheriff's office and file a complaint. You can get witnesses. Some of you even have brothers and fathers who go down and get a rope and hang the fella, right? You never exhausted your ingenuity in avoiding the snares and eluding the power of a hated tyrant. You're not in the position I am. I am utterly powerless with this man, and the law will back him up. To put it bluntly, he can rape me again and again and again and again for the rest of my life, and the law will do nothing about it. And that's not the case with you. You have the law. Now, whether or not justice happens, I don't know, but you have the law, and the law doesn't even protect me. You never shuddered at the sound of his footsteps and trembled within hearing of his voice. I know I did wrong. No one can feel it more sensibly than I do. The painful and humiliating memory will haunt me to my dying day. Still, in looking back calmly on the events of my life, I feel that the slave woman ought not to be judged by the same standard as others. So she's fearful, like Rosen is fearful for her character. Fearful that she will lose sympathy with the reader if she doesn't go out of her way to do this. That'll tell you how strongly people felt about sexual mores at the time, because you're like, well, wait a minute, this woman was stalked. I mean, the man constantly was trying to sexually assault her, and you're going to get onto her because she got pregnant? I mean, what choice did she couldn't marry the man. She couldn't have a real marriage with somebody. Okay, yeah, I mean, having a child out of wedlock may not be the world's most ideal circumstance, depending on the situation, but my goodness, look at what she was up against. I mean, what else are you going to do? You're going to blame somebody who got raped in Auschwitz for I mean, really? But the standards were quite different. The temperaments were quite different. And in fact, it was women who frequently were the harshest on other women. Unfortunately, I think that's been the case frequently in history. And she has to go out of her way to do that, and see to it that everything goes. Okay, so I'm going to cut this off here because it's long enough. We're going to have a quiz. Question number 1, how did Harriet Jacobs' grandmother react when Harriet told her she was pregnant? Be very specific, okay? Number 2, what plan does Dr. Flint have to keep Linda out of sight and continue their relationship? Also be very specific. I'm going to put a discussion post up for you as well. I'd like your thoughts on that particular question or topic, or 2. I'll give you maybe a choice of 2 this time. You can kind of take a look at it. And if you could get me, I know I'm a little bit late on this, if you can get me the answers to the quiz and make sure that your postings are up no later than Tuesday at midnight, that would be wonderful. All right. And we will see you in class on Thursday.